Hello, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Chatham House. I'm Adam, and I'm from ICT for Peace and the Tech Against Terrorism project, which is a joint initiative by the United Nations Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate and ICT for Peace, in partnership with the leading technology companies. ICT for Peace is a Swiss-based NGO. We promote cybersecurity and peaceful cyberspace through international negotiations with governments, companies, and non-state actors. We also explore and champion the use of internet technologies for crisis management, humanitarian aid, and peace building. Our project, the Tech Against Terrorism project, is directly mandated by the UN Security Council to help promote the benefits of improved collaboration between the private sector, civil society, and government regarding countering the terrorist use of the internet whilst respecting human rights. So why are we here today? Well, we're here today to discuss the terrorist exploitation of the internet and practical ways we can help improve capability in the tech industry, but specifically focused on small tech companies. And why small tech companies, you might ask? Well, actually, in reality, terrorists exploit an overlapping ecosystem of services, not just the big platforms like Facebook and Twitter, but also the small ones as well. In fact, the Counter-Terrorism Internet Referral Unit, which is based in the UK, last year reported content to the social media companies across 300 different services. And of course, the issue with small technology companies is that often they don't have the expertise, the scale, or resources to handle this challenge on their own. While the large technology companies have already developed what we've termed the emerging normative framework, which is designed to tackle terrorist exploitation of internet technologies, this framework is based on self-regulation, terms of service violations, investing in human expertise, and developing transparent reporting to improve oversight and redress. So our project is really focused on global needs assessment for small technology companies, really working towards developing practical tools and day-to-day advice and content for knowledge sharing. This will involve advising on terms of service and also focus on everyday concerns for small tech companies. Specifically, we're also focusing on collaborating and partnering with the industry-led Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism, as was announced by the leading technology companies a number of weeks ago. So underpinning this work is the principle of proportionality and the importance in respecting human rights and freedom of expression. With internet technologies, of course, we're not just talking about one country, but we're talking about a need for a global response that also emphasizes the overwhelmingly positive influence of the internet on society. So, concluding my opening remarks, in this debate, there are some fundamental questions which hopefully we'll touch upon today. So what is the role of violent content online? And how is this compared and contrasted with the more subtle influence, for example, through the so-called ISIS NHS videos, which certainly include no violent content? Therefore, how can we meaningfully define harmful content online? Is content takedown the only solution? What about countering extremism through online influence campaigns? What about the opportunity to use social media for the benefit of countering extremism in this sense? And also, how significant is online versus offline radicalization? And finally, what about the often damaging influence of inflammatory depictions in traditional media and newspapers? How can we foster a media landscape that promotes community cohesion rather than divides it? Today we will hear from 3 big tech companies, 1 startup and representative from the UN. And speaking to everyone just now, the conversation will focus broadly on 3 areas. 1 around the benefits of algorithmic responses and the challenges associated with that. Secondly, the need for human involvement in making complex decisions in the context of terms of service violations and self-regulation. And finally, also speaking to the role of small tech companies and the importance of partnership. But before we begin, I'd like to thank a few of our supporters, including Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Twitter, Kaspersky, and Telefonica. Additionally, we've received generous support from a number of governments, including Switzerland, the Republic of Korea, and Spain. I'd also like to thank Daniel Stauffacher, the president and founder of ICT for Peace, as well as our work with the Institute of Strategic Dialogue and also the Global Network Initiative. We have a range of very interesting people in the audience and on the panel, and hopefully we'll have some stimulating conversation. After the event, we have a reception around the corner at the clubhouse, and everyone is cordially invited to come. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Erin Saltman, who is the Policy Manager for Counterterrorism and CVE at Facebook. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I think in 5 short minutes I'll try to tell you as much as I can and welcome many questions afterwards with my fellow panelists. But thank you to Chatham House and ICT for Peace for hosting this. It's obviously a very timely subject matter. I mean, talking from Facebook perspective, working across our platforms, so that's Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, and WhatsApp, we really do have a policy ethos that there should be no place for terrorism on Facebook and our products. It's the implementation of that that then becomes quite complicated and very interesting very quickly. And we divide that into 3 basic approaches. One is around advancements of artificial intelligence and machine learning technology. The other is around human expertise. And lastly, around partnerships. Around artificial intelligence or machine learning, we're really looking at a number of advancements in how we can handle both the scale and the diversity of terrorist content or terrorist propaganda or networks. And we've been advancing increasingly, specifically around image matching, so image and video matching. When we know there's a piece of official, for example, Daesh propaganda, how can we put that into a photo bank as such? And when other people try to upload that image, we can match that. And in many cases, that means that image will never even hit the platform in the first case. And in other instances, it means we need to analyze who is posting that and under what context they are posting that. Since, as you know, mainstream media also shares imagery, and so do sometimes activists and whistleblowers. So how do we make sure that machines can surface things really well, and then human review can take it from there in many cases? This is also around language understanding. So machine learning works in that the more data a machine gets, the better it is at finding patterns or different sorts of repeat actions. So that's around what does praise, support, and representation of a terrorist organization look like? Can we find language patterns? Can we perhaps find predictability around that? This is also around removing terrorist clusters. Research around terrorist networks shows that offline we see networks and clusters. When you look at foreign terrorist fighter networks across Europe leaving to go and join Daesh, this didn't happen randomly ad hoc because we saw offline neighborhoods, localization, and networks. And similarly, we find those networks and clusters online. So once we surface a certain individual or group, how can we then fan out to find other individuals within that cluster that can be reviewed for takedown? We're also getting really good at recidivism. How do we know that it's the same user that was a bad actor before that's trying to regain a new profile? And what factors can we look at so that we see that it's not just a repeat person saying that this is their 50th account and trying to regain followers? And lastly, across platform, how do we make sure that that can also be carried out on our other platforms? But human expertise is absolutely necessary in this. Machines have never been really good at nuance. Even as a human reviewing something, what's the difference between saying, oh my God, I'm going to kill you, versus I'm going to kill you? The tone and context are really important when we look at what is just one online post versus the context of the wider agenda. So human expertise includes operations teams that are based all around the world, working in different languages 24/7 to review the type of content flagged to them around this topic. But it also includes counterterrorism subject matter experts. So I myself do not look at other types of damaging content. I'm only focused on counterterrorism and counter-extremism work on Facebook. But also law enforcement, former law enforcement and safety officers. How do we assess threat? So when is it not just a bad post, but something that might have a more damaging or potential real-world harm? And how do we escalate that accordingly? And those things have to be carried out by humans. So we have a huge amount of operations teams that generally review content, but we also have over 150 individuals that their either majority or full-time job is only around counterterrorism. And that's from operations, law enforcement, subject matter expertise, policy, and that spans across it. But really, we see also that this doesn't happen in isolation. Nobody just has a Facebook account these days, or just has a Twitter account, or just has a YouTube account. And it's also not just on the big platforms. We see that one platform might be used for a general dialogue, and then it might jump to a smaller platform to have more illicit conversation, or content might be hosted one place but then shared another. And this means that with this network, we really rely on partnerships. This is the reason that a year ago we developed a hash sharing database so that we could all upload these contentious pieces of official global terrorist propaganda so that we could work together on making sure that content could be reviewed and taken down across platform. And that's now opening up to smaller platforms. But also why we announced the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. This is not just something that affects one country or one platform, so we need to think more holistically and be more innovative so that when we see threats evolve, which they evolve very quickly, a platform might be really popular one month and then not as popular the next, and how do we stay ahead of the threat? And that looks different in different regions. Only by working together are we able to actually evolve with the threat and get ahead of the curve.
Super. Thank you very much, Erin. So moving on to Nick Pickles, who's the Head of Public Policy and Government UK and Israel at Twitter. It'd be great to hear more about your perspective.
Thank you. And one of the challenges of working in this space is speaking at events after Erin, because so firstly, as Erin said, thank you to ICT for Peace and for Chatham House to bring this conversation together. I think it's a conversation that, for the much has happened too much behind closed doors. And I think one of the legitimate concerns and questions that we have as companies is how do we have these conversations about what is and is not acceptable online in a more public forum with more people around the table, not just a closed door conversation between companies and governments. Because actually at the heart of this and the heart of what I want to talk about now is collaboration and the real value of collaboration. And you know, we're in London, we're in Chatham House, you know, bringing together the Foreign Office and the Home Office and civil society groups and technology companies is really important in how we understand these challenges and how we solve them in the longer term. So one of the things I want to start with by saying is this is a global process. And Erin's already mentioned the global forum that we've established as industry. And one of the real challenges that we face is that definitions and language change as you move around the world. Even definitions of terrorism change as you move around the world. So when we're considering how to discuss these issues, language is very, very important. Because we may use a word like harmful, but actually in a different context, the word harmful is used to describe content which might be pro-human rights. It might be pro-free media. It may be defending LGBT rights. So how we define the language that we discuss these issues is very, very important. For Twitter, we've actually taken the step of including in our transparency reports a report which many companies, you know, Twitter, Facebook, Google, and others now publish, detailing the actions they take in response to government requests, to copyright requests, to court orders to remove content. And we took the decision to include in that data the number of terrorist accounts that we were removing. And one of the things that this data reflects is the pace of change within industry. So 18 months ago, we published our first report in February 2016. And around then, about 1/3 of the accounts that we were detecting for terrorism, we were finding through using our own technology. And actually, one of the things we found was that the tools we had designed for spam became very useful in this fight. Because as Erin says, often the people we remove from our platforms will try and return very quickly. People may try and open several accounts at the same time. So the tools we'd developed for spam fighting could be redeployed in this area. Fast forward a year, and from detecting 1/3 of those accounts by technology, we're now detecting upwards of 75% of those accounts by technology. And we're removing a huge number. So looking to the period up to December the 31st, 2016, we'd removed 376,000 accounts for promotion of terrorism. Bring that forward to present day, and we've actually suspended more than 650,000 accounts for promotion of terrorism. Now, those of you familiar with the academic work of J.M. Berger will know that those numbers are actually far higher than many academics thought existed. So we've been able to really dig deep into this problem, find accounts breaking our rules, find accounts promoting terrorism, and remove them, in many cases automatically. So where we've been able to develop technology, where we have a high confidence of accuracy, we can take those steps automatically. But I want to pick up on a point that Erin made because it's really important. Hopefully my microphone won't fall out of the back pocket. Technology isn't the only solution here. The same piece of content can be used to satirize, to criticize, to call out, as can be shared by someone who is promoting terrorism. So there isn't a solution where you say, let's remove every instance of this piece of content, because some of those instances may be instances where we want those people to have a voice. Some of them may be journalists. Some of them may be NGOs highlighting what's going on, academics talking about these are the changing tactics, and that conversation matters because it helps us understand and call out what's going on. So looking forward, we have the Global Forum, but that wasn't the first industry step. We have the European Internet Forum, which developed technology around sharing the image hashes that Erin talked about. It brought together member states in Europe, the European Commission, and industry to talk about how we can collaborate to solve these challenges. And the Global Forum will allow us to develop that work, bringing in more stakeholders, bringing in more countries who have very different experiences of these challenges. So when you look at the way that Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab are using technology, it's very different to the experience that we might face in Europe. But we need those global voices around the table. Those voices are also really important because they'll help us defend free expression where it's most under threat. In some places, where free expression is under threat by governments calling it terrorism, when we might call it human rights defense. So we need to have this global debate with the proper people around the table. More of it needs to be in public. And we need to highlight as an industry what we're doing already. Because I think for too many people, the perception is that industry hasn't responded, when actually we've been doing a huge amount of work, removing a huge volume of content. But we need to expand on that work. We need to scale it up more. And critically need to bring that expertise to the small companies, because what we see is when we remove content from our platforms, and the more hostile that our platforms become, those people move to other platforms. They don't cease using the internet. So we need to make sure the expertise that's built out in the larger companies helps smaller companies as this migration takes place. And the work of people like the ICSR at King's College is doing really important work highlighting where that migration is happening. And some of it's in public, some of it's in not. Because that's why it's also important to have a wider discussion. And so all of our companies have spoken how important it is to reform the MLAT process and how it is that we can work with governments to ensure that criminal investigations can proceed. So proposals around the UK-US agreement and issues that discuss how we move forward in a properly legally robust way with due process and the rule of law. Those discussions need to happen in public as well. So hopefully this afternoon we'll have the opportunity to discuss many of those issues. But I look forward to hearing from questions later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. So, Anku, you're the public policy analyst at Google. Perhaps you have a few comments.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all for having me to speak. I will say that this is my first time doing this kind of event, so I'm excited and terrified in equal measure, so apologies if that comes across. You know, look, I think this is an incredibly important issue, and terrorism is an open attack on all of society and at the values that all of us hold dear, including the values that we see come out on platforms like YouTube. So, you know, YouTube, we see across the community and across the content that we have online 4 real values that we believe strongly in, and that is freedom of speech, freedom of information, freedom of belonging, and freedom of opportunity. And, you know, terrorism is much an attack on all 4 of those qualities as well, and all 4 of those freedoms. And so we are deeply invested in tackling these kind of problems. And like others have said, we don't believe that terrorism has any place on our platform. And we recently announced 4 steps that we are taking to further kind of tackle these problems and these issues, and 4 things that we can do that fall into the kind of areas that Erin and Nick have touched upon. So the first of those is on technology, and there is scope for technology to be used ever more to try and identify some of the content that is problematic in these areas. And so we ourselves, we've developed a lot of video analysis models. We've got content classifiers that we're training ever more using machine learning. And we found that in, for example, video analysis models has helped identify and assess 50% of the terrorism-related content that we have removed from the platform in the last 6 months. So it's increasingly helping us make these, tackle the scale of the content that we see online, and as Nick said, dig deeper into the content that we see there and ensure that we are trying to remove content where appropriate. I think a second area is on Trusted Flaggers. So Trusted Flagger is a program that we run that, as Erin and Nick alluded to, is an ability for us to form partnerships with experts so that we can really understand the issues behind the content that we may see online, and that we can understand some of the nuance behind the content that we see online. And so we work with groups like the ICSR, we work with ISD, we work with CTRU, which is the Counter-Terrorism Police Unit here in the UK, to really understand the context so that we can make sure we're making decisions where a certain video might be seen in a certain light if it comes from one kind of account, but it might be seen in another light if it comes from a news account, or if it's there for satire or for education. And we're expanding that program to work with a further 50 organizations across the world, and we're providing them with operational grants so that we can really benefit from their expertise and ensure that we have a broader range of expertise and knowledge in tackling these issues. Another area is kind of borderline content, and we see that there is often content that might be inflammatory religious or supremacist content that really doesn't fully violate our policies, but we know exists in this kind of grey area. And we want to achieve there the right balance of free expression, but also ensuring that there is not this more kind of sensitive content online. And what we're doing there is we're introducing a new mode called view-only mode, where we will try and restrict those videos from having access to certain features like comments or thumbs up or sharing directly from the video, so that we can strike the right balance there and ensure that these videos have a right to be expressed, but they don't necessarily have access to all the tools for promotion. And then finally, it's an area that was touched upon by Nick and Erin, and that I personally believe very strongly in it. It was a large part of why I wanted to join a company like Google, is counter-speech and the opportunity to use social media platforms as a beacon for tolerance and diversity and inclusion. And we see this across the world. There was a really powerful campaign a while back for people to talk more openly about their sexuality that really helped a lot of people across the world, especially in places where LGBT issues might not be as openly discussed. And I think that there's the same opportunity to speak about positive communities and positive senses of belonging using platforms like YouTube. And we have a program called Creators for Change, where we really try to amplify some of the voices online that are doing that. So, we work with this fantastic individual called Humza Arshad, who is somebody who was an actor, a Muslim actor, and was finding that he was getting quite stereotypical roles. And he decided that he was going to make a YouTube channel where he would use his acting skills and his comedy skills to really talk about difficult social issues, difficult religious issues, but in a kind of funny and engaging and creative way. And his videos now have millions of views, and we have supported his videos, and he's worked with the Metropolitan Police, he's worked to go into schools to really talk to kids about these kind of issues, and we really want to support those kind of messages, and we believe that there's more that can be done there to promote those kind of counter-narratives. Another area where we think that you can promote counter-narratives is in redirecting people who might be searching for harmful content. So we have a think tank arm of Alphabet called Jigsaw, and they have a method called the redirect method, which was really about targeting certain search terms and providing those search terms that might be reinforcing particular ISIS narratives to join ISIS campaigns. We found that you could redirect people who were searching for that kind of content using counter-narrative playlists of YouTube videos. And they reached over 300,000 people, and they managed to, the videos that they displayed were viewed over, I think, 500,000 minutes of watch time through this program. And that's something that we're really interested in expanding and delivering more broadly. And then finally, I think, all that cannot, as the others said, be done in isolation. It needs to be done in partnership, both with governments, with civil society organizations, with other large companies, but also with smaller companies, and ensuring that we are sharing the best practice that we develop, that we ensure that we are sharing the resources that we develop with others, so that as this content exists across a whole range of platforms, all can partake in ensuring that it is limited in its scale and reach.
Great. Thank you very much, Anku, for that clear explanation of what Google and YouTube are doing to tackle this problem. So slightly shifting gear now, we have Mariusz, who is the owner and founder of JustPasteit, which is a small technology company that maybe some people are familiar with. So now it would be really good to understand your perspective from a small company.
Hi, I'm Mariusz, and why we are talking here about JustPasteit, because it's a good example of a small company that's running web application that's being abused by terrorist propaganda. To give you some background, I would say what is JustPasteit. It's a small company that consists only of me. It's a single-person company, and it operates from Poland. But what's interesting, 60% of users are speaking Arabic languages. It operates in 24 languages from all around the world. It receives 5 to 10 million visits by user every month, and there is about 60,000 nodes added to the platform every month. So you can see this is a lot to look after for one person. And to my surprise, when I started the company, I wasn't planning that I will be sitting here, because the fact that terrorists started to use it was a big surprise for me. The service wasn't designed for such purposes. So when I started to receive some complaints from all around the world in very different languages like Hindi, Arabic, and so on, the languages I wasn't familiar with was a big problem for me. Also, the reports were in different formats, were in different languages. I didn't know who I can trust, because not always the word police is something you can trust all around the world. I didn't know which laws applies to my service, because something can be illegal in the other part of the world but can be legal here. And I didn't know how to process such big amount of abusive materials by myself. So I think what small companies need from the bigger ones are mainly the know-how, how to operate with these materials, how to identify them, and also some legal advices. And also there's some technological background involved, because, for example, in my application, it's relatively small, but about 1/3 of a code is responsible for processing abusive content, so it's quite a large amount of application. So we see that from one side there's a need for know-how, and also a need for some help with resources, with ability to process some things, some solutions, and technological aspects.
Brilliant, excellent, and hopefully we'll have time to delve into the details of that support later on in the Q&A. For now, David Shariat is the Director and Chief of Branch for the UN Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate at the UN Security Council. And I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, and thank you, Adam. And I have 5 minutes, but I wouldn't like to start without thanking you, Daniel, ICT for Peace, and all the great partners that we have here. What I would like to do is to a little bit zoom out and share with you how we see the perspective from the issue from the perspective of the United Nations Security Council, and we look at it as in the following way. Terrorists are early adopters of technology. From the days that Al-Qaeda was dropping DVDs in the offices of Al Jazeera in Doha, to today, terrorists are early adopters and know how to utilize technology to their advantage. Today, what we see is that the entire terrorism cycle, from radicalization to recruitment, to training, to financing, to preparations of the attack, and even the perpetration of the attack itself can be committed or is committed through heavy use of technology, including social media, including instant messages, including every possible tool that companies developed in order to offer all of us services that we could use to our benefit. What the future will take us, we do not know, but we are very concerned that if we go to the next step, that what we're seeing now in technology, issues like drones, Internet of Things, 3D printing, all this can be used by criminals, are used by criminals, and probably a matter of time till they will be used by terrorists. So we need to adapt our response. We are gone with the days where we thought that terrorism is a matter of only governments, law enforcement, security services, and intelligence. These days are gone. Today we know that terrorism is a matter of a whole of society. It's something that all of society needs to be involved and engaged, and this is probably the only way to win. And London knows it more than probably any other city in the world. And we need also to move from the days that we see it also as something that happens within one society. And we are moving that from these days. That's something that happens within one country, within one state, based on the relations that exist between the government and its citizens. Today we are in a global world. Terrorists never knew boundaries, but particularly when communication allows them to move or to plan attacks in one country and commit it in a completely different place in other part of the world, we need to develop solutions that are global, that go beyond even governments and look at all of our globe actually working together. In this regard, we cannot find, from our perspective, better partners like the companies that are truly global, the companies that are being used by all individuals around the world. So if we are thinking of the next step should be probably beyond all of societies within one country to all of us working together with corporations that are truly global. What is the underlying fundamental principles that should govern us is that we have to be committed to the same principles. We don't have to agree on the way, we don't have to agree on the why, but we have to agree, as the participants here from the companies clearly illustrated, that terrorism has no space in their platforms, but at the same time, they want to guarantee that all the rights and fundamental freedoms that are given to all of us should be protected and cherished on their platforms. When we agree on all this, we could do a lot more. Of course, the challenge is legal, the challenge is technical, but at least when we have such a broad consensus on what needs to be done, we could work together. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Very interesting hearing the perspective from the Security Council. So one quick question from me before opening up to the floor for Facebook, Twitter and Google, and that's specifically around the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism and the Tech Against Terrorism project. And so how exactly do you see this working with smaller tech companies to improve capacity and knowledge sharing?
Well, I think the way that we've decided on presenting this global forum is first of all, it should be a two-way conversation. So it shouldn't just be, although we will help convene and knowledge share ourselves, that this should also be a two-way conversation of knowledge sharing, and that actually the experience of some smaller platforms can bring new things to the table that we might not have even thought about, or a new approach or a new trend. I mean, just from even internally, half of the trends that we end up finding are because users will flag it to us. So when other industries are also flagging how trends are manifesting on their platforms, it's highly significant because that's how you get ahead of the curve. But also bringing in the tech innovation, enhancing what we started as just 4 big companies with Microsoft, Twitter, Google, Facebook, with things like photo, image, hash sharing. How can we make that an infrastructure that isn't so difficult to onboard smaller industries? How can we make sure smaller industries can also plug into that and utilize that so that they have a tech advantage in some of these spaces? And lastly, also, there's still a lot to be done in the academic space. You know, we tend to assume, for example, that terrorist propaganda is highly influential, and yet we always doubt that counter-propaganda has any influence. But actually, there are questions around, you know, how can we be strategic with counter-speech or counter-narratives or alternative narratives? It seems like we were better at talking about this during the Cold War, maybe. Like, now we forgot how this works because it's online. But how can these strategic communication channels in the areas where censorship is not the only solution? You cannot censor an ideology. History has proven that censorship alone does not usually work in this space. But academics also, where do we see the online and offline interplay? When does online speech turn into offline action? And actually, that's not been really clearly laid out. A lot of people talk online about doing horrible things, and a very, very tiny percentage of those people do that. A lot of people share controversial propaganda that are not terrorists. So where do we see the lines get drawn, and how can the academic world help us in that as well?
Yeah, and I think one of the really important things about the Global Forum is firstly, it's building on work that's already been happening. So the European Internet Forum was a forum where the hash sharing project that Erin mentioned, where you shared image hashes, was developed. That's a technology solution that works for big tech companies. But one of the challenges is if you develop a technology solution, then you need resources to deploy that technology. And as you've just heard, actually, sometimes smaller companies need far more practical tools. So designing a big technology tool that works for Google, Facebook, and Twitter, and Microsoft, and then presenting it to smaller companies isn't always the right way forward. So the forum's an important place where, you know, there's been a lot of collaboration going on in private between our companies, where we would meet, we would regularly discuss these challenges. But the problem with that was that if you are a small company and you're not based in Silicon Valley, you have no way of tapping into that community. You have no way of accessing that knowledge. So the forum will bring together a way of actually the small companies knowing this is where I can go, where it's a safe place to admit they have a problem. Because for some companies, just admitting that that is a problem isn't particularly easy, particularly if they're discussing this with governments. And then understanding, well, actually, which of our companies has the right expertise to help you overcome that challenge? And then, more importantly, not being static. So this isn't about saying, this is your problem, here's a solution, thank you very much, that's it. It's been an ongoing process to make sure that industry keeps up with the changing threats. Because as you've heard, you know, the more action we take, the more behavior changes. But then also making sure that the envelope is constantly squeezed, so that the space becomes more hostile in a growing part of the internet. And, you know, 100% success is very, very difficult in any area. But we can achieve real progress in making the internet a hostile place by sharing expertise, by sharing technology. And then also in the longer term, meaning that when companies face these challenges, they can proactively reach out and say to somebody, we need help. Because at present, that one step is actually quite difficult.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add, and from Nick's description there, it almost sounds like therapy. But but you know, the only thing I'd add is that, as Marius pointed out, it's not just building those connections and those communities with other tech companies. It's also ensuring that Marius knows the right trusted people to talk to, that we can introduce them to the experts that have helped us develop our work, that we can introduce them to CTRU and ensure that the conversations we have where we understand more you know, expertise on the content that we're seeing, that they have that as well, and that they have you know, trusted contacts out there.
Great, thank you very much for that insight. So in the name of time, I'll open it up to the floor. Just to remind everyone, when they ask a question, to give their affiliation and to try to keep the question as concise as possible. So please raise your hands if you have a question, and we'll try to get to you in front. Well, yeah, I'll take them individually for now and then cluster later on, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. Alistair Kingsmith, I grateful, Adam, for you asking me to speak. I represent the Foreign Office, but also speaking on behalf of the government of the United Kingdom, and I head up what we do on countering extremism and violent extremism internationally, but also previously helped initiate the Counter-Daesh Coalition Communications Cell, and now co-chair the Global CT Forum's efforts on countering violent extremism. So 3 points and then just a question, if I may. First is to commend you all, because I think this initiative and what you're doing here and the work of both CTED and ICT for Peace in this area is really crucial. Building the sort of practical tools that are necessary for all sorts of companies to tackle this is clearly fundamental. Secondly, you'll have seen from our Prime Minister's statements that we, as the UK, are mobilising international support to really get governments to put more efforts into this area. In the last month, we've had the group of 7 big industrialised countries, the European Union, the G20, Five Eyes countries, all expressing greater interest and commitment in this area. So there's a real opportunity to pick up your suggestions about developing innovative partnerships between government and industry. But the question, I think, as Erin, you were saying, is it's not whether, but how do we do this? So, I mean, I think for my final point is that really recognising the Global Internet Forum that you've announced as a really important step is a question about how we join up between industry, government and civil society. And the challenge is how to do that and operate at a greater pace and scale that really meets the evolving threats that you've talked about. So my question to the panel is, what more do you feel the governments can do to make this project and the new industry-led forum a success? And my commitment is to help get that from other governments. So I'd be very interested in your views. Thank you.
I mean, really quickly to that point, and thank you for those points. They are really crucial. It's as we said, we're hostile to terrorism, so what next? What do you do? I think government incorporation is really important because you have a lot of information, and we're not asking for classified information, but sometimes just internally knowing the trends. It's really hard to work with unknown unknowns. And as soon as we have a known, then we can collaborate around it and use our various expertise and make sure that the machine learning has somewhere to start on that. And so that's really important. And as we said, the Big Four have always had ad hoc relationships with governments bringing information to them in various ways, but a lot of other industries just don't have that dialogue in the first place. So how can we use this as a communication channel to open up that information and just basic government threat assessment so that we understand the landscape that we're dealing with in different parts of the world as it changes? But also, how do we share to other industries, what does a government request for information look like and what do you do with it? Those are not necessarily intuitive forms unless you have an infrastructure to have lots of lawyers in the room. So that's, I wouldn't even be processing that. That's when you get a lawyer in the room. And if you're dealing with one individual that is so impressive with the tech they've evolved that terrorists want to use it, they don't necessarily have a team of 20 lawyers to look over government requests in a court case or requests to remove content. And again, this is somewhere that we can create a coordinated response and help people respond to government requests of information. When is that legal and not legal, and when does that breach human rights or not breach human rights, and when is it necessary for a court tribunal against a terrorist case? So those are really important areas where governments do need to be part of the conversation.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, and the FCO's contribution, indeed the whole UK government's contribution to really being a really keen and early supporter of the forum as a concept. I think that was really important to build that international support. I think there's 2 things for me that come into mind. Firstly, viewing this as a global issue, and the importance of taking into consideration the different operating environments that we work in, and accepting that in some cases there are legitimate areas where government and industry have different roles. And so Erin touched on there the transfer of user data. Reforming the MLAT process, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty process, to request data between countries is something that absolutely is a government-to-government process, because that involves local law, international law, being written and debated by parliaments and passed through Parliament or the US Congress or as appropriate. So recognizing where you need that government action as well as industry action. And in some countries, what they try and do is they try and get industry to fill that gap. And that puts us in some very difficult situations. And secondly, to touch on a point that was made earlier, we talk about as Aaron says, you can't outlaw an ideology, but we can promote values and we can promote ideas. And one of the things that is incredibly important in this space is achieving international norms, international consensus around the types of material we are talking about, and defending free expression where it needs to be defended. And so it doesn't become, one of the things that we see is when a statement is made in one country, a different government will repeat that statement and say, we just want the same thing. But it just so happens that their definition at the heart of it is radically removed from what we might consider in this room as being a fair definition of, for example, harmful content. So making sure that governments defend those norms of free expression that are embodied in, again, UK law, international law, is really important.
Yeah, and I think to build on that point, the only thing I'd add is that it's doing that with transparency and doing that in collaboration with the right other organizations that have an interest in this. So, not only on the technology side of things, but also the civil society of things, both those combating terrorism itself or combating hate speech, but also those civil society organizations who are defending human rights and free expression, and ensuring that governments are having these conversations about things like terms of service in a transparent way, because, there we're trying to talk about things that go beyond the law, and so ensuring that those conversations are had, with others that really care about ensuring those are done in transparent ways is really important.
If I can add something, I would say that governments also need to better cooperate with each other, because even across the European Union, different police officers don't cooperate to each other in the way it should be. For example, when they are sending takedown notices to the companies, almost every police across Europe does it differently, and this is something that ICT for Peace is trying to address. Also, the Europol is trying to do something on their hand, but I think that the companies should see that all the governments are cooperating with each other, and then they are looking for contact with the companies themselves.
Just to add to the inquiry, what governments can do, I think, is support, nurture, promote, give space for this initiative. What a little bit worries me is of a bear hug, that the beauty of this initiative is its voluntarity. The fact that the companies came together and said, and with one clear message. I am worried that governments endorsing too much the initiative will create some dynamics that will change the forum in ways we not necessarily will benefit from. Another thing that governments can do is to support similar initiatives in other areas of counterterrorism that may benefit from such voluntary cooperation of the big players, but that's probably a different topic, including, by the way, on the MLA challenge. I think there is a lot that could be done, and ICT for Peace is involved in another initiative that may help in this regard too.
Thank you very much. So I'll open this up to the floor, maybe collecting 3 questions this time instead. So firstly, the lady there with her hand up. I think someone will come to you.
Julie Andrews, Queen Elizabeth Academy, Chatham House. A question to the representatives of Facebook, Google, and Twitter. Question to the representatives of Facebook, Twitter, and Google. How do you make sure that people who review the suspicious material do not bring their own biases to the review?
Great. And second question, gentleman at the back. At the back, so yeah, just behind.
Jan Eger, Thomson Reuters. My question, or rather actually to first pick up the AML point there. I think there are lots of tech firms or companies out there that provide services that can help companies, corporates, the financial services sector fight terrorism, in particular also money laundering, slavery, and so on, through various lists, databases. And at the moment, the European Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is somewhat ambiguous about all of this. So I wondered really, are you facing any legal challenges or questions in your work in fighting terrorism from the GDPR?
Thank you very much. And I think there's a question over here, the lady with the red jacket.
Thanks, Gabrielle Guillemin, Article 19 Free Speech Organization. Thank you very much for your presentations. You've talked about disabling terrorist accounts and removing terrorist content. Given that there's no definition internationally of terrorism and that there are multiple definitions of terrorism in various countries, what definition do you use? Do you rely on a list of designated terrorist organizations, and what problem does it raise? And very quickly also, in relation to the Global Internet Forum, given that in some countries a terrorist might be, say, a journalist or a human rights defender, how can you tackle any concerns there might be that, by sharing technology and expertise, then that technology and expertise might be used to crack down on journalists or human rights defenders? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So 4 questions there. Firstly, what about the bias of reporting mechanisms? Secondly, what about GDPR ambiguity? Thirdly, what about the challenge of definition? And fourthly, what about the risk of expertise and knowledge sharing being abused?
I'll start with the first and third, since I work specifically on this, and maybe you guys can touch in. But I think all of our services, when it comes to reviewers, there is a bit of a triage system. So a user flags something, and the vast majority of what users flag to us aren't really illegal. Sometimes it's just like Justin Bieber music videos. So unwanted but not illegal content. And then it goes into a section where my own biases, there you go. But then we have a triage system. So if somebody is reviewing most content, it's really straightforward. It's pretty obvious. Everyone's gone through standards training. I've gone through the training, even though I'm not an operations person, so that I understand where our platform guidelines go. And those evolve as well, and we're notified. Whenever it's something tricky, if it's terrorism related, that actually triages to a team of specialists that only work on terrorist related subject matters and have language expertise that's quite extensive. So that would be a team that it's not just a 5-second review, 10-second review. That team is given the ability to look into that more in depth. And there's actually a lot of in-house self-review. So if there's a double review process, and we realize that somebody maybe is not making the right calls, we question if that's that they need more training or if there might be inherent biases, and that's something that internally we're trying to always see. There's going to be human error. 1 billion photos are uploaded every day to Facebook. Obviously, the vast majority aren't flagged to us and aren't bad whatsoever, but just to look at scale, that sometimes mistakes are made. And that's why it's possible if content does come down or if an account comes down, you can actually you can dispute that, and you can actually flag it so that it has another double review of it, so that there is actually a process where you could say, I don't think that my account should have come down. But it's never a one strike as well. You're not dealing with people that accidentally post one thing that's bad and then their account comes down. There are thresholds. So one-off dodgy content by a slightly racist uncle, that doesn't mean their entire account comes down. There's a process for reviewing a more holistic approach to a profile. It's a big deal to take away somebody's ability to have a profile or for a group to have a voice. When it comes to definitions of terrorism, a lot of us refer to more globally understood lists of designated terrorist organizations, whether that's the US Department of State's list of designated terrorists or the United Nations list of designated terrorist organizations. So we're talking specifically about violent organizations. The ones where we have the most robust machine learning around are globally recognized violent terrorist organizations. So that would be Daesh and Al-Qaeda related organizations. So we wouldn't be looking at groups like Pussy Riot and deciding that they're a terrorist organization. There's definitely a more academic internal review that has to do with that it's a non-governmental entity carrying out strategic violence based on an ideology, and we would review that with the other designated terrorist lists. So we would probably, for some parts of the world, be considered too liberal and not strong enough on how we define that, but we are also referring to other internationally recognized resources like the United Nations.
Yeah, and actually the first question and the last question highlight an important issue, which is that, so I mentioned that we remove upwards of 70% of the content through technology. Actually, only about 2% of the content we remove comes through as a result of governments telling us about that content. So the vast majority we're finding ourselves. But actually, there's an opportunity to find terrorist accounts without looking at the content. And so when we're thinking of technological solutions, one of the challenges is sometimes you can focus on the content rather than thinking, if someone's just opened 100 accounts at the same time from the same place, well, actually, that's why that triggers our spam systems. So we can take down accounts without discussing the content because the behavior of the account, the signals that we can draw from it, break our spam rules. They break our rule that says you can't have multiple accounts doing the same thing. So in many ways, enforcing our rules even before you get to the question of terrorism definitions, allows us to act on accounts. And that's a problem we see across a range of actors, which is why investing in that technology yields benefits in different areas, not just in terrorism. On the regulation point, I think it is really important that we have, when we're discussing things like GDPR, which I think the clock is ticking, the UK has 11 months to come up with a solution for. It does really matter. Obviously, for our businesses, the safe harbour privacy shield arrangements were incredibly critical. There is ongoing litigation right now. So making sure, again, that governments are involved in those conversations and understand industry concerns is really hard. But I can't say I've come across yet a specific example of where the GDPR has been cited to us as being a reason. But this is one of the questions we're going to face as collaboration deepens between industry. Because it's one thing us using information, but then as people ask us to share information between companies, that's where absolutely we have to make sure that the legal framework works for user privacy and to achieve the policy ends that we're trying to work through. And then finally, I think the question around misuse. It's absolutely something, technology is neutral and our companies can use it and we can collaborate our tools in different ways. It's why it's really important to have ICT for peace around the table and the UN Security Council mandate. It's why we want more civil society involvement. This is something that we have prioritised as industry, is that we say we want civil society in the room, talking about terms of service, talking about these questions, because that might be where civil society and industry can identify questions for government, where they can act. And I think, just to finish David's bear hug point, that concern is perfectly illustrated by the concept that this is seen to be owned by governments. One of the really, really important values of the Global Forum is its independence. And this is industry working with other industry companies. That's what means that a company in South Korea or a company in Indonesia will feel comfortable talking to us because they don't feel that they feel it's a safe space to have that conversation. So the risk of undermining that independence is something that will, that's really something we've got to bear in mind. But certainly from a free expression point of view, hopefully what you've heard today is that those concerns are absolutely front and centre of our concerns as we build out the forum.
The beauty of following Erin and Nick is that I have very little to add. But the one thing I would say on the point about bias, I think that's crucial to all of us. And like Erin said, we have lots of processes in place there. The only thing I'd add is that we also have an appeals process. So ensuring that if something is taken down, that the user can appeal that decision and ensure that it is reviewed again. The thing on definitions, I think Erin and Nick touched on the list that we might refer to. But I think broader as a point, it's really crucial one that we all agree on, which is that language really matters, particularly when you're talking about things as broad or as vague as harmful content or extremist content. And that is something, to your earlier point on work with governments, that we do need to do transparently. We do need to ensure that it recognises the global context of this work. And that's something that we all recognise as a really tough question and want to work together more on.
I would have loved to speak about the definition of terrorism. It's Chatham House, but Chatham House rules don't apply, I think, to this meeting, right? So I would think I would leave it here.
Well, I think we have maybe time for... No, we definitely don't have time for more questions. However, we are having a reception around the corner at the clubhouse, and we have members of the team to direct you there. We'll have sandwiches, coffee, and so on, and we'd love to speak to you and hear more questions you might have. So thank you very much to Chatham House, and thank you very much for coming, and also the panellists.